Welcome to the Peace Corner podcast. This series is brought together by GPPAC, UNOY and CSPPS. Each episode will bring to you a different peace builder and their personal story. In this season, we dive into the topic of inclusivity. How do we meaningfully bring this concept beyond tokenism? How can we truly involve women and youth in peace building?
Young women and men still suffer from stereotypes, myths, and policy panics that harm their agency and affect realizing their full potential for peace.
The evidence is clear. Development is not sustainable if it is not fair and inclusive.
Our efforts to build and sustain peace need to be democratized to include the communities most affected. Young people are our best chance in succeeding.
In order to break the status quo and make the world a better place, we need gender equality. The fantastic phrase, "women's rights are human rights," must become the spine of all our political work.
We are here today for another episode of the Peace Corner podcast, and today we're going to dive into the topic of youth, voice and agency. Today we have Anne de Graaf, who's a lecturer at Amsterdam University College. She's also the Chief Diversity Officer of the University of Amsterdam and an author of over 80 books published in 50 languages and have sold over 5 million books worldwide. The first question I would like to ask you is, what motivates you to carry your role as a peace builder?
It's funny you should ask that, because that's a question I often ask the people that I interview or research, but no one's ever asked it of me. I think it's twofold. I come from what we call in social sciences a low socioeconomic background. So in my family, there weren't very high expectations, let's put it that way. And I graduated from a high school where 720 people graduated and only 3 of us went to university out of state. And for me, then education opened up the world and got me out of a very bad, very dark situation. So I think I've always been watching for the people who aren't represented and who don't have a voice. And then couple that with an experience I had when I was researching some books, and I was in a refugee camp in Western Tanzania with Congolese refugees. And smart, really fantastic young people. Actually, it was a university that had to close because of the war, and so even the professors were in the camp, and they were conducting classes for the 52,000. There were 52,000 people, and half of them were young people, and they were conducting classes with no resources. And the classes were so good that the Tanzanian villages were sending their children to the refugee camp for this education. And those things meshed together, I think, have fortified my motivation to not so much speak on behalf of young people, but to open up listening spaces for them. And before I was in academia, I was visiting a lot of post-conflict countries. I've been in every country in sub-Saharan Africa and Liberia and Iraq and Lebanon and Bosnia. And those interviews that I conducted for my books there convinced me that young people are not only stakeholders, but they're important actors in the peace building. And they also shape conflict, but they also shape peace building. And yet there's so little research being done on this issue that those things all came together. And I don't know, youth agency and voice just seems to be my filter. Mm-hmm. And if something ticks all 3 of those boxes, then I try and say yes and then see where it leads me.
So basically your research for your books pushed you to go back into university and do a PhD on the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was writing all these books, and at some point I'd written an adult novel, and one of the characters was a child soldier, and his voice was based on interviews that I'd had with former youth combatants. And then so that novel was published, and I was giving a reading about it at a university here in the Netherlands. And the students were so engaged and so on fire. So we had an amazing discussion. And afterwards, a friend said, "You're glowing. You need to pay attention." And I thought, you know what? I'm going to do a career change. And so in my 40s, I decided to go back to school. I still had to get a master's. And then I went and got a PhD also in peace and conflict studies so that I could teach. And I've only been teaching for 10 years, so some of my colleagues who are my age have been doing it for 30 years, but I love it. I absolutely love it, and I'm so grateful that I've found something in my life that gives me so much joy and fulfillment. So that's combining the best of all my worlds, really. Teaching and doing research in this area. Because in my writing, indeed, I kept coming up against the same questions. And so that's why I thought if I go back to school, I might find some answers. And they were questions like, why is a child worth more in this part of the world than in another part of the world? And why aren't young people given a place at the peace-building tables? I don't have many answers, but now I do have a framework to hang my questions on. Yeah.
Speaking about your PhD, I would like to dive into some of the main questions that your research addressed. And I would like to ask you specifically with relation to voice, agency, and youth. How do you think that voice enables youth to claim agency within a divided society or within a society in conflict, let's say?
Well, it goes back to the 70s. One of the feminist theories was standpoint feminism. And they asked the question, where are the women in international relations? And when you ask the question, you see the women. And the next thing is you hear them. You see them as diplomats' wives or as prostitutes or as working in the kitchen. And then once you see them, you can hear them. So I took gender and I transposed it into generational theory. And so I asked the question, where are the young people? Where are the children? And we see them then as youth combatants or as street children or as factory workers or as students. And once you see them, then you can open up a space to hear them. And when we hear youth voice, then they automatically start exercising agency, because either we ignore it or we take it on board. And the people in power decide what level young people will be allowed to participate. And my research shows that the greater amount of participation, the less chance of violence due to the so-called youth bulge or even high youth unemployment in a post-conflict country. That when young people are involved in the peacemaking process, that peace is more likely to hold. And it makes sense, but it's just young people are often viewed as risky and ignorant. But I like to say, how many risky and ignorant middle-aged people do you know? My students always put up their hands, so it works both ways. But they're really, so that was my research, was to show that there's a benefit for the entire society when young people are given a voice and exercise agency.
Mm-hmm. And as you were mentioning, youth, because of this youth bulge, youth in security discourse are often conceived of as this threat or as potentially radicalizable, let's say.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on this, and what ways can we address this issue and, let's say, reverse the frame to kind of conceive of youth as a peace dividend instead of a threat?
Well, so the youth bulge is often only framed in terms of unemployment statistics for young people. And if there's high unemployment among young people in a place where there's a large population of young people, then automatically the assumption is they're going to be hanging around, causing trouble, inciting violence. And there's a flip side to that coin, and that is that if there's a large youth population, then there's also a great source of creativity, energy, and ideas. And this is shown in research also, that young people often have ideas that don't cost much, are elegant, and are unusual. And this can make a huge difference. So, for example, at the end of the war in Sierra Leone, there were so many adults that had been killed in the war that the youth combatant commanders were invited to participate in the peace building. So these were leaders who were leaders in war and who became leaders in peace. But as soon as they had established a framework for the reconstruction of Sierra Leone, they were marginalized, and then the politicians took over. And that was a lost opportunity, because Sierra Leone is one of the few places where we have research that shows that youth peace builders really can make a mark. But we're seeing it more and more now, thanks to social media, that young people have claim that voice. We see it in climate change and in many issues that young people, sometimes under 18, are having a voice and creating agency. So it's a dynamic that goes hand in hand.
And how can we ensure then that these voices are heard where it matters, and that they let's say are allowed to have an influence, and I don't know, they're used to make positive change in a way?
Well, it all comes back to power dynamics and who's in power and who has the voice. So at the University of Amsterdam, for example, in 2015, there were protests. Administration building was occupied by students, but also by faculty who were demanding change. It's not a comfortable process, but sometimes if a marginalized group isn't being heard, and I consider young people in some situations to be a marginalized group, then they have to step forward and demonstrate and protest. And then sometimes that's a step in the direction of being heard. Now, being heard is just an initial stage. After that, then it's a matter of participating. And the highest form of participation is going to young people and saying, "What do you think?" And then just letting them take it and run with the idea. But too often we'll have one young person in a management team as a sort of token. So you asked what are the things that can be done, is for people in power to become conscious of the rich contribution and actually the necessity of opening up these listening spaces for young people. So within schools, these are student councils, and I'm working with other universities who are hesitant to give this agency, but I'm, showing them the benefits of it, and it really is just a win-win situation, because then also we enable and empower future leaders so that they feel that they belong and that they have a contribution to make. And you mentioned radicalization, and 15 years ago we thought that people who were being radicalized were poor and uneducated, but now we know better. They're often middle class and well educated. The problem is that they don't feel that they belong in the society, and they feel, and they've been labeled as a loser for whatever reason. So if you have a space for youth participation and they are exercising agency, then these young people are going to realize that they do have a contribution to make. Because the people who radicalize young people say to them, "No one wants you here, no one appreciates you here, but come join us and you will count, you will matter, you will create something new and very special. You're important to us." And that's something that our society has to learn to say to all young people as well.
And you mentioned before that often young people or in general marginalized groups are brought to the table in this tokenistic manner.
If at all.
If at all.
If at all,
yeah. Like if we're lucky, let's say they're included to the table in a tokenistic manner. How can we go beyond this tokenism, and how can we ensure that peace building is meaningfully inclusive?
Well, by having more people from those groups. So, for example, people or lecturers, educators assume that if you've got four, let's say, 4 black students, and you've got 4 student groups, then you put 1 black student in each group, and that's diversity. But that isn't how it works. You need to keep those 4 together, because then they feel empowered and safe, and they have each other to reinforce each other, to actually voice the ideas that they have. So the same is true for young people. You don't just have one, you get a small group of them, and then you have to prove that you're willing. So they have agency and they have project, and the project falls through. They learn how to make decisions and how to take responsibility for those consequences. But it's also about holding the people in power responsible, because people don't like to give up power. They won't give up power unless they're forced to, and until they go through a crisis, and unless they're convinced that there's benefits to it. So we need to kind of sell the idea that young people who choose to engage in these issues bring something to the table that's worth having. What they bring is that golden goal within the peace building world, which is sustainable peace. that lasting peace is the thing that everyone aims for, and it's like this huge dream that negotiators work toward and politicians promise, but it's practically impossible to achieve. And the only way that we can more fully understand the complex dynamics of peace building is to get as much information as possible. And that means having young people at the table informing us on their issues. I mean, for example, I was in Liberia at the end of the wars there, and I was interviewing former youth combatants, and they were saying to me, and these were smart young people who had, who could speak a couple different languages, and they'd managed to survive a war, but they were smart enough to know that they couldn't survive peace without certain skills. And one of the skills was how to read. And because the schools had been closed for at least a generation, all these 20-something young men didn't know how to read, and so they were desperate to learn how to read. But the schools mostly stayed closed in Monrovia and outside of the city because the people who were qualified to be teachers were hired by the UN and by NGOs, and there they got good salaries, much better salaries than they would as teachers. And so most of these young men just went to Côte d'Ivoire, to the Ivory Coast, to fight in that conflict because that was something they knew they could do, and they could do it well, and they could survive. But this was an example of how if young people's voices had been heard, then policy would have changed. Those schools would have opened, and we could have kept them within a peace, a post-conflict situation, and they could have helped build the peace in Liberia. But too often people don't even, they just focus on collecting the weapons, and as a first step, instead of putting together focus groups and saying, what do you want? What do you need? Yeah.
Speaking about youth combatants, as you said, many of them not having the skills and not having the possibility to learn skills went off to other conflicts because that's what they knew, let's say. Often also for child soldiers and youth combatants, there's an issue that when they try to return home, they're not accepted anymore in their communities, and they're even marginalized and stigmatized. During your research for your books, what is your experience of this? And you think that might be some other reason why they are pushed to go to look for other conflicts, let's say?
Yeah, so young people often take care of each other when no one else is doing it for them. And so that's what my research shows. And also we tend to frame young people in either as what I call the lion or the lamb. So either you're extremely a monster and you're abhorrent and you're an animal, or you're this sweet, innocent angel. And there's very little room for nuance in how young people are framed. So former youth combatants are seen within their own societies, especially if the people in those societies are not well educated, as animals. And even though they might have been forced to kill or forced to do things, that doesn't matter. And even if they had to do these things in order to survive themselves, it doesn't matter. They're heavily judged. And people forget the fact that there were no adults around to protect them, so they had to do what they needed to do to protect themselves. So when the conflict is finished, often, indeed, they can't return back to their communities. Communities don't want them. They don't know what to do with them. And they're deeply traumatized. Maybe they're drug addicts. Maybe they've been sexually abused. They've witnessed horrible things, maybe even cannibalization. So, what do you do with someone who is so broken? What happens in real life is they often end up taking care of each other. I found a group of former youth combatants who had started a pizza restaurant in Mwanza, and they just figured out that one of them could cook, and one of them had a sweet smile, and one of them could keep the books, and this is what they did. And I found another group where they had started a football team together, but this is often what happens. When you look also even at our schools and our dormitories, when there's problems, it's often the students who take care of them and take care of each other, eating disorders or social safety. So it's a big problem, and I think I know the UN is aware of it, but in a post-conflict situation, most of the time they're spending all their time and energy on, as I said, on the weapons and trying to get the warlords to come together and talk and form a government. But Just as there's growing attention for women who've been raped during a conflict and how that should be framed, there's also growing attention for how young people can be rehabilitated. But they need to be listened to, first of all. And often what they want is very practical and easy to give. They want to learn how to read. They want to be able to make a living. And those skills are often very easy to transfer.
And within your role as a teacher, maybe also within your role as a Chief Diversity Officer, what do you think that inclusivity means for you in your position and with your given responsibilities for these positions?
Yeah, inclusivity is tied with voice and agency. Somebody has said that it's not about being invited to the party, it's about helping organize the party. That's inclusivity. So, and diversity has become such a terrible word. I don't even like it anymore, and it's part of my title because it means so many things, and a lot of people, they just check the box of diversity and go back to telling their jokes, and which offend people or have a terrible impact. So inclusivity is about creating a space where people's voices are heard and where they can exercise agency. That's what it means to me. I mean, you'll find 1,000 different definitions of it. It's asking the question, who are we missing? And whose voices are we not hearing? And why is that? And how can we go find these people? And often they're frustrated, they're angry, they're hurt, they're in pain, they've given up, they're cynical. So now you have to create a space where you can say, what you say really matters, and you can co-create this new policy, this new future for this school. We need you. It's not about here I am to help you. It's exactly the opposite. Would you please help me? So that's what I do, is I listen to a lot of different kinds of people, and I invite them to co-create. That they come to me and they say, here's a problem, this and this is happening. And I say, well, what do you suggest? What do you propose? And how can we work together to make this happen? How can I help facilitate this? Mm-hmm. It's very exciting. And because it's the University of Amsterdam, and because it's the city of Amsterdam, and because we have a tradition of youth involvement and participation, it's thrilling to have such a great pool of young people who want to be involved and who have terrific ideas. And often, the deans or the executive board will say, okay, this is how we need to do it, and then I'm listening and they're listening, and the students say, actually, you might want to try this and this and this first before you tackle that. And we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And it just works. It's a win-win.
So yeah, focusing on your role as a teacher, it's really interesting to hear how you moved from doing your research on these topics to then wanting to teach again. And then how do you see your role as a teacher and education in general as contributing to inclusivity in a society and also diversity with this regard?
Well, I see education as the golden ticket. It's the way out it's the answer to so many problems. It's the way out of poverty. It's the way for people to develop to their full potential, to flourish, and to live a meaningful life with dignity. So I'm grateful that in the Netherlands, people can pursue an education and not be hindered by a lack of wealth. I come from the US, and there, as you know, students are yoked with terrible debt. Parents have to take out a second mortgage, and often people don't go to university because they just simply can't afford it. So education is key. And I made a conscious choice because with my travels and the interviews and the books, I took a step back and I thought, okay, how can I most effectively spend the next season of my life? And I thought education is the way, because we get the students on board, and then they have a ripple effect and go on and have careers, and they have they have a ripple effect, and even more so than my books, which sold poorly or moderately at best. So now, I have former students who are in Niger and in Kinshasa and in Nairobi and who are working in peace building. So I try and inspire the students with the idea that what they have to say and what they want to do is important and can make a difference. And for many students, this is the first time that they've heard that message. And they start to dream. And then they realize that they can get a master's, they can work in the field, or do research, or teach. And some of my best ideas have come from students, and I've worked with students also on books and research. But I've also learned from them. I mean, the idea to apply for the Chief Diversity Officer job, for example, came from a former student. And I was arguing with her, and I said, no, it needs to be a person of color. And she's like, that's not going to happen. And we need a bridge builder. And, and you need to do this. And I was like, oh, okay. Thinking about it, wondering about it. And then I went to good friends of mine in Southwest who come from the African diaspora. And I tried it out on them. And they said, look, we don't care what color you are, as long as you try and get the job done and make the university more accessible to our kids. So then I thought, okay, maybe I do have something to contribute. And I think, and that's the key, is with education, I can inspire young people with the idea that they do have something to contribute, that everybody has something to contribute. And it's such a privilege, because now I'm actually, all my worlds have come together, because I'm teaching a class on peace building where I take students to Kosovo. And then we study peace building, peacemaking, and peacekeeping, and we see how theory and practice interact. And it's amazing to watch the students. They think that there's a right and there's a wrong, and there's good guys and bad guys, and then they hear the perspectives of one side of the conflict, and then they hear the perspectives of the other, and they're like, but how can both of these truths be the case, and how does that work? And you see them struggling and actually growing to a point where they can accept conflicting perspectives, which is the key to peace building.
So in your experiences working in the field, but also relating that to your experiences working with more policy-oriented work, such as in your position of the Chief Diversity Officer, obviously there's been some commitments with regards to policies on the international level with regards to inclusivity and diversity and peace processes. What is your experience of the relationship between these, let's say, grand policies and frameworks and what actually happens at the grassroots level in these local communities and contexts?
Well, I think I'll refer to something that I did for my research for my PhD. So I did my fieldwork in South Africa. And the reason for that is because the South African Constitution is the most inclusive in the world, actually, never mind the continent of Africa. So it's all written down, it's all on paper. And when Nelson Mandela came to power, one of the first things he did is he set up these focus groups for young people around the country. And then politicians and social scientists were sent to these focus groups to collect qualitative data about what are young people's concerns and what were their ideas. And so, I mean, he created these spaces so they could literally co-create a new nation, because young people are always, framed as the future generations, but that sounds nice, but, they rarely have a say in what their future is going to look like. But Mandela was wise enough to know that in order for that to become true, he needed to actually listen to them. So all this data from these focus groups came together, and they incorporated within the Constitution and within the legal framework of South Africa specific laws that had to do with children, children's laws, children's acts, so that and much of it came from the Convention on the Right of the Child. But it was like they had the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which they ratified, and then they surrounded that with a supportive structure, which was legal and judicial. So it was the best possible scenario for opening up a way for young people to participate in policymaking. But as what often happens, you get a disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality. So even though it all looks great on paper, it's not happening in reality. And that was what my research was looking at, was how big is this disconnect? In what areas do we see it? And so there were pockets, and that's what I call it in my PhD, pockets of areas where young people were bringing on board and they were participating in changing policy. So there might be a community, for example, within a corrupt municipality, and the politicians were taking the money that should have been used for providing clean water. And the community had been protesting this and nobody was listening. And then they used the CRC and they got their young people to protest about this, and that caught the media attention. And so the media started, naming and shaming the politicians. And eventually they were thrown out of office and the new municipality leaders came in and they got their water. And so it's just one example of how when things are framed in terms of youth agency and youth rights, the whole community benefits from that. So, and because South Africa has it all in order and on paper, they can have court cases. And so there was also a legal aid organization that I worked with who provides free legal aid to children who are taking their municipalities or their schools or their teachers or their politicians or even their parents to court. And the laws are in place. So now what has to happen is a body of precedents has to take place. And then you'll see the norms and values shifting and you'll see things changing. I mean, for example, social safety is such a huge issue because of the AIDS pandemic. And now it's a normal thing for 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds to be given very articulate lessons on condoms and on how to say no and how to travel in groups together. And teenagers are taught to watch each other's drinks so that somebody doesn't spike the drink. But this has become a norm now in South Africa, and that's how culture changes. But so I can't give you a golden rule because every culture is different. But unfortunately there has to be a crisis before the people in power are willing to share this power. But there's enough crises going on around us where I think this is going to be happening more and more. And because of social media, we see the ideas and what young people are organizing and what they're proposing, and most of it makes sense. And so then the next step is to say, well, we need to include them. Even the UN is seeing this, and UNICEF also. It used to be that you'd see children taking UN ambassadors to their seats in the General Assembly, and that was literally seeing young people but not hearing them. But now you see more and more that the youth representatives really do have a say in things. And even the Model United Nations, some countries, the MUNs, go to their governments with policy suggestions. And in some countries, those suggestions are taken on board. So it's a process, and it's just going to keep on growing, I think. But it's, as with all marginalized groups, the ones in power are reluctant to share that power. But I don't think they have a choice, really, because our society is changing. And if we say as a university that we're trying to prepare future leaders to the best of our abilities, then they absolutely have to have intercultural skills and know what it means to have a discussion with somebody that you disagree with and how to do that with respect.
Well, thank you very much for your availability for this interview, and what a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Peace Corner. Interested in hearing more from us? Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you might be listening.